I feel like this is a point that most people should be able to agree with me on, but it does feel like across the last few decades, when you talk about video games released in the East, no country has released as many iconic titles and IPs as Japan has. In spite of all the popularity that all of their games have had, not as much is actually known about the game industry in Japan as compared to the rest of the world. Even now, many people still wonder why Nintendo is as aggressively against fan-made transformative content on YouTube as they are, and why they would do something as going after the Smash World Tour, which just happened 2 years ago as well. It's because they're assholes. It's what I would say if not for the fact that the Nintendo ninjas are outside my upper floor window just staring in waiting for me to say the wrong thing. And while it would be easy to write them off, I feel like it would be better for us to look at all of the other reasons that could contribute to what makes these companies do the things that they do. And even when you look at things such as the mobile game industry, you start to notice that games have started to have a shorter and shorter life cycle, with many titles actually ending servers before they even finish their first year of operation. And with this series of videos that I'm planning to do going forward, I plan to look at as much of the industry as I can, using Japanese as well as global sources, as well as my own experience working in the industry, as I've worked across many companies, both big and small, ranging from companies like Koei Tecmo and Gang Ho to even smaller ones like Gramarye. Don't look up that last one if you're under the age of 18. Now, some of you might look at the fact that I've worked across multiple companies and already raised an eyebrow. Some of you maybe wouldn't even realize why I'm even making this point in the first place. But we'll get into that later into this video as well, so you can just hold on to that. We'll get back to that in just a bit. And so what I'm planning to do is to use this first video to talk about the work conditions as well as the work culture within the game industry in Japan. And the reason for this is due to the fact that when it comes to work culture in Japan, obviously many people have made many videos about it in general. But the thing is that what I want to do here is to zoom this in on specifically the games industry as well, because I'm not here to deny anybody's experiences. Obviously, there are many issues with the work culture within Japan as well. And there are many people, both foreign and local, who have had many bad experiences just even working in Japan in general. And so I figured what I want to do is to try to give this as balanced of a look at as possible. Because on the one hand, you have many people talking about their horrible experiences. And then on the other, you have many people doing videos such as, I spent a day shadowing a person from a certain industry and it all looks like sunshine and rainbows. But at the same time, even as someone working in Japan, I can look at many of those and I feel like, while it's great that they're trying to give Japan a better image, some of it feels very overly optimistic. And at times, I would say, especially depending on the industry you're going to do these videos for, it can end up being a little pretentious on no fault of the YouTuber themselves, but more so on what the companies try to ensure that they show to these YouTubers to give them of an idea of like what the industry is like. And so what I want to do is to try to strike a balance between the two with this first video. And then with what we know about the work culture and working conditions within Japan, we'll then move on to talking about in the future videos how this working conditions end up impacting creativity within the Japanese game industry. And from there on, we'll slowly go on to talking more and more about how and why the industry is in the state it currently is in today. I feel like I've made this entire opening seem a little too dry and serious, but as much as I am in a stiff and stuffy suit here, I don't want to be as stiff as... I don't want to be that stiff, so we'll be talking about this, hopefully in a little more casual way going to the rest of the video, though many of the points are, to some extent, quite serious as well, so I'll try my best to balance all of this out without making it seem like I'm taking the piss either. So one of the iconic things that people might think of, those who know a lot about Japan at least, when it comes to working in Japan, are black companies. Ooh, did you see that? Looks to be some pretty dark stuff down there. For those of you who do not know what those are, you can basically think of them as just highly exploitative companies with very horrible, potentially law-breaking working hours. They don't pay you the overtime you're supposed to get. Sometimes they don't even let you take leave. There are many issues that these companies have come to characterize within the industry. And while many forms of Japanese media still like to portray these kind of companies and take the piss on them, such as in games and anime, I want to look at how common these types of companies still are within the game industry and how much the characteristics that define them still apply to modern companies as well. Now, needless to say, some of the points I'm going to bring up are going to be similar to what other YouTubers have talked about as well, and it's, to be expected due to the fact that we are talking about a characteristic of a type of company which many people have also criticized in the past. And so while it might overlap to some extent, what I'm planning to do is to try my best to give it a game industry leaning, and on top of that, to talk about some of the unique characteristics of the Japanese game industry in terms of their hiring or work practices that aren't as common in other industries across Japan as well. So come, join me in this video about the thing and the stuff as we go into it with me doing a dramatic pause because I don't really have a cool opening to do for this part of the video. Ah, yes, overtime, the favorite word of many forms of Japanese media out there. One of the easiest ways to get your protagonist of your anime or game to be able to go out of his house to fight monsters without his parents worrying about where he has been disappearing for the past 6 hours of the day. And it is also one of those things that many people think of as being synonymous with working in Japan. And, well, with that I have to say, though that said, things have been slowly improving over time, so it may not be as bad as some people might imagine. Well, slowly, so it still kind of is not the best. But when you look at the data provided by the Ministry of Health, Labour and Welfare over here, what you see is that in terms of the overall number of overtime hours a person works in a year, there has been steady drops, especially when you compare how bad it used to be in the Showa era, right down to the Heisei era, which starts I think somewhere in the 80s, I could be mistaken, all the way down to where we are today. Now, of course, in the graph, you can see that recently there has been some level of stagnation, but overall, you do start to see that every few years or so, the total number of overtime hours that people do per year is slowly starting to decrease even then. And indeed, when you look at the actual national average for the number of hours of overtime people are working a month, it is somewhere around the ballpark of around 10 to 12 hours, which kind of checks out with the data we just looked at. Which 10 to 12 hours means that either you're working around a half an hour of overtime every day, or maybe you're working like 1 or 2 hours on one day and then going home on the clock for the next few days instead. Now, obviously, this does vary with industry, and when you look at something like medicine, for example, it actually goes even lower, which is great, you know. I would be very worried if the surgeon who is doing an open heart surgery on me just suddenly during the middle of the operation just went up and like,
major fracture detected.
It would actually be quite terrifying if something like that just happened out of nowhere. So it's good to see that the medical professionals are actually being protected. Then meanwhile, on the other side of the spectrum, you have people who work in the postal service as well as in logistics who just seem to work a lot more hours of overtime than the average. But even then, the average for them is around 25 hours. Still a pretty bad number, since that does mean that they are on average in a month working maybe 1 hour plus of overtime at minimum. But suffice to say, at the very least, we are past the era of people having to work like 3 to 6 hours of overtime a day, sometimes working till the last train and then not being able to get back home anymore. Which I guess also means that karaoke places are going to be doing a lot worse as well, since nowadays they don't really get as many people staying overnight due to them missing the last train anymore. Though that said, of course, the thing with numbers reported by the government is that you can't always trust all of it. Now, hear me out. I'm not some kind of crazy like, the government is against us, they have spies and they put it in our rice bowls or something like that. I'm not going crazy. I just mean it because of the fact that for a lot of people out there who are suffering from pretty bad work conditions, obviously they aren't going to report the horrible work conditions that they're in to the government. Like, you can imagine, right? Like, if you are being heavily oppressed and overworked at work, for example, and a government official came up to you and was like, "Hi, would you like to be in our survey? Please do tell us how many hours you work overtime a month." Like, obviously, you're not gonna, like, report the company that you're working in, right? Like, if you were that kind of person, you probably wouldn't even answer the surveys for the most part. And so this number, it might be a little bit skewed to some extent. So another way we can look at this is to also look at data provided by job recruitment sites, since those are used quite commonly in Japan whenever people are either looking for a first job or looking to switch jobs as well. And when you look at the information that they provide, it would seem that they also estimate the average number of overtime hours a person works to be about 10.5 hours, which is still 2.7% lower than the previous year, according to the data I've gathered from multiple job hunting websites. And the reason why we're using job hunting websites is because these are very commonly used in Japan, especially in the game industry, for job hunting. Most companies actually put up most of their openings on these job hunting websites, and it's typically considered easier to get into a company using this, as many of them have connections that allow them to directly reach out to people within the development teams who are hiring. So you basically skip the step of having to go through HR, who may not have as good of an understanding of what the industry or the job actually requires as well. And these companies basically also try to gather their own data sets on what the industries that they are basically helping people find jobs in are like. And so more often than not, they'll try to get data on how much in terms of overtime and the like that people now are already working within their respective companies. And with people who are already job hunting, you can at least expect that the data would be more genuine due to the fact that their information is going to be kept anonymous as well. They'll be more likely to provide the more accurate numbers of their working conditions in general. And what we see from one of the biggest sites, Doda, is that game creators in general in Japan work on average about 25.8 hours of overtime. This is from data from 2023 as well. And even across the three companies that I've mentioned that I've worked in the past, because I can't talk about the current company I'm working in due to certain NDAs and all that, only in one of them did I actually feel like I was coming close to the conditions that will be considered a black company in terms of the work hours alone. I'm not going to mention the exact company since I don't want to start stirring shit for no reason, and I do know that it doesn't happen to all people within the company, only those that are like within specific teams dealing with specific projects. Because one thing you've got to understand with how overtime tends to occur within the industry and what tends to skew it is the fact that when you add in basically live ops for mobile games especially, it tends to skew these numbers in a certain direction due to the fact that all the maintenances you have to do sometimes at odd hours of the day, all the bug fixes, all the extra time that you need to prep for these data going live or also designing new stuff coming forward tends to result in people just working more hours in general as compared to development. And that is something that I've experienced quite a bit myself as well. It's mostly when I was working on mobile games that I found myself working like 9 to 9, 5 days a week. One day of the weekend you're on standby, maybe sometimes both days, due to the fact that especially for older mobile games, like we're talking about like Rage of Bahamut levels to around the era of like FGO, all that, where the industry was still in a wild west, and some companies were just basically releasing events like 5 days out of the 7-day week rather than having a 2-week span between each event. It is in those type of projects that you tend to see people rushing and scrambling the most and working the most amount of overtime. And due to the fact that the weekend is when people typically tend to play the most, especially in Japan, even for mobile games, some of these projects, they just have events that start on the weekends, and it's just a fact of life for them because of the fact that it's a lot harder to change that entire culture midway through, especially with the way that the events were designed for the game without going through a complete overhaul, which might piss off certain groups of very highly spending players. But if you work in development, unless your team is highly incompetent or something went horribly wrong in scheduling, you typically tend to see people working less hours of overtime. In the development projects I worked on across the years, you tended to see that the overtime per month tended to be maybe around 10 to 20 hours a month, and like 10 hours at times can also just be due to the fact that I left the workplace like 30 minutes late because I wanted to resolve some stuff, or I wanted to not look like I was going home on time every single day because of the fact that some of that fear, even though the company doesn't really mind it, some of that like force of habit from back in the day still exists. So it's not like the 10 hours are necessary in some days or cases as well. But one other thing you kind of also need to take into account, which many of these websites, when they show overtime hours, they don't actually explain or show, is also the fact that the number of work hours a day isn't consistent across the entire industry. When we talk about a 9 to 5, for example, some people might think of working literally from 9 to 5 and then clocking out at 5. But for some countries, a 9 to 5 means that you're working the 8 hours of a 9 to 5, but you also have a 1 hour lunch break somewhere in the middle, and that 1 hour lunch break, because of the fact that you can't really go home and you're basically forced to have a 1 hour lunch break in the middle, basically means that your work hours are technically 9 to 6. And so what you find is that there are obviously gonna be a group of people who are less averse to working overtime simply due to the fact that they already know that their work hours are one less than what many people are working. And as a result, when these people like mention that they are working like say 20 hours of overtime a month, they are still basically working there about the same number of hours as people working in other companies as well. And the psychology of being able to go home 1 hour earlier sometimes results in these groups of people. I know that sometimes I'm also like guilty of that, being willing to stay back a little more to actually get work done, especially in periods where stuff is a little more rush. And you have to remember that with Japan, you're paid for your overtime. So since overtime pay is basically higher than your normal base salary per hour, many people actually do just decide to stay back and work more to earn more as well. And as a result, the numbers can be a little skewed even within the same industry. But once again, this number can vary a lot depending on the ways that you're involved with the industry, with people within mobile game live ops typically spending more hours than the people who are in development instead. And so if you're going in with the idea of planning to do game development instead, unless the company isn't all too competent. And so if you're planning to go in terms of development instead, unless your company somehow ends up in a crunch situation, typically you won't see people having to work that much overtime there as compared to people working in mobile games where being constantly on the ball is more a requirement of the job as well. Speaking of overtime pay, however, there are also many horror stories that people have heard of companies basically telling people to work overtime and not declare that they're working overtime at all. A practice so horrible that it basically earned its own slang, with people ironically calling it service zangyo or service overtime, where you're basically giving the company free service of overtime hours. Yeah, it's completely horrible, I know, but nowadays in the Japanese game industry, you don't tend to see that a lot. Many companies in the industry now are starting to pay out a segment of the overtime hours as a flat sum that, okay, she's not that flat, but as a flat sum that is basically given to you regardless of whether or not you work overtime. And this amount can vary a lot between companies. Some of the more traditional small, medium companies are paying out maybe 20 hours, and many of the bigger companies now are basically paying you a flat 40 hours of your overtime, whether or not you work it. Many of the companies also do give it out as a way to basically discourage people from working overtime, as it is also a way for companies to psychologically try to get people to just take the money and leave, because no matter how hard you work overtime, unless you're willing to break the law yourself, you wouldn't be paid any more than you already are. Even across the companies that I've worked for up till now, including the one I'm currently in, only one company has paid me less than 40 hours of overtime. And across all the companies, as I mentioned before, only one of them really actually forced me to work a lot of overtime to begin with. With the rest of the companies, the overtime was really around 20 hours thereabout. And with the one that I'm currently in now, especially after all the overtime I had to do in the past, it kind of like ruined my health a little. So I ended up going to a company that required a little less, so it's around 10 hours on average a month, give or take. Some months is a little worse, some months is a little better due to the fact that with games, you don't really know when that's going to happen as well. But so far, across those companies as well, I didn't really get any complaints for knocking off on time too often. Even for me, most of the companies that I work for paid out the 40 hours, with only one company paying less than that at 20 hours. Even the company that I mentioned where I worked excessive amounts of overtime, they paid out the 40 hours, and they did also provide replacement holidays in a way for if you work over an excess number of hours on the weekend as well. Nonetheless, there were still safeguards to at the very least try to some extent to ensure people are compensated for the excess work they had to do, even if they didn't have, it would seem, any proper way to ensure that people actually didn't work those hours. Speaking of getting days off, let's talk about what is considered a day off in Japan as well. See how I'm like getting all of the transitions perfectly smoothly like this? It's not every day we can do this, but does it feel good when it does happen? In Japan, the idea of what is considered a rest day is a little weird perhaps, especially considering how it is displayed in job openings as well. In Japanese job openings, what you tend to realize is they will typically have the position, and somewhere in brackets they will say that you get X amount of days off, and the days off is like in the hundreds plus thereabout. If you think that means that you're gonna get like an extra 120 days of like leave or days off to like rest or something, bro, come on, this is Japan we're talking about. I mean, I wish we were, but we ain't. Yeah. Rather, the 100 plus days off that they're talking about are basically all public holidays, as well as all weekends, not excluding your paid leaves instead. Which I get that it might sound quite weird, but the reason why they do this is because, in the past at least, there used to be many companies that also forced their employees to work on Saturdays as well. Like, the weekends weren't the sacred thing of you get both days off, and so many companies now, in order to attract people in, there's still this old practice of putting the number of days off that a person can expect to get outside of their leaves. And with many companies, or at least with the standards that have been defined by the Labour Department, whose name is very long and that I can't for the love of me remember in English well. The Ministry of Health, Labour and Workforce. The Ministry of Health, Love and Workforce. The Ministry of Hate, Love. The Labour Act recommends 105 days as the minimum that a company needs to provide. Anything below 120, in fact, is already considered quite iffy, which is why you will notice that, especially for big companies that are known worldwide, they tend to state at least 125, and they're always above the 120 mark. And the reason for that is precisely because of this. If you're wondering how these numbers are being decided, essentially if you assume that a year has 52 weeks, and you give a person every single weekend off, that's 104 days, plus, Japan has 16 days of public holidays, so you get up to 120. Many companies also give extended holidays during the end of the year period, with some companies doing it from like the 25th of December to the 3rd of January, and some companies give more, some give less. The same for the Obon period in August, some companies give an extended break there as well. Like, you can just look at the listings that I'm just showing here right now as well. Companies like Cygames, Capcom, and Grammarly as well promise at least to provide you more than 120 days per month. Bruh, did you find a way to time travel or something? How the fuck did you come up with 120 days per month? Okay, it seems like my brain somehow folded in on itself. I mean 120 days a year. But yeah, while this is not a statistic that is tracked as comprehensively as work hours and pay are, you can still very easily check it for yourself across the many job hunting sites within Japan, which are also accessible from overseas. So suffice to say, you will probably find that many of the bigger companies, even the moderate sized ones out there, do provide at least the minimum average of about 120. And even when it comes to paid leave, the thing that most people understand as the thing that you can take whenever you want, and that all companies in Japan are required to give to their employees, there is also the impression that many people in Japan just do not use those leaves much, if at all, which is not exactly true, for the most part at least, due to the fact that you are required by law to at least take 5 days a year. But with many black companies out there, of course, the ones that are the most abusive, you tend to see many cases of people truly actually not taking those days off. In fact, some of the people that I knew that worked in the IT department in many other companies in the past, or some of them, especially those that get outsourced to a separate company by that company, they tend to end up in situations where they are not actually able to freely choose when to take the leave. Instead, the company just fixes it as they get 1 day off per month, and the company fixes the day for them, so they don't really have the freedom to use those days off, or any days off for that matter, freely when they need to. Which is just great, because it's not like sometimes I need to go down physically to a department to submit my finances, or to actually pay or deal with my insurance, or go down to the prefectural body to actually deal with like some clock-up because, and it just so happens that all of those bodies work fewer hours a day than the average person. No, I'm not salty. I'm totally not salty at all. But yeah, according to other data provided by the Ministry of maybe Lemon Hills, most people use up about 62.1% of their leaves, and this is a improvement across the many years since the past. Obviously, it's still pretty low compared to many nations in the West. And when it comes to the game industry as well, what you do see at the very least is that this is also another piece of data that isn't tracked as well. So I can't really point to a specific data set and say this is the average across the industry. But at the very least, when you look at the bigger companies as well as the moderate sized ones, the ones that do try to look corporately responsible do tend to post this data as something that they flex as well. Companies like Nintendo and Capcom, they will basically put on their very cool sunglasses and go like, yeah, win, and basically post the fact that they actually have a leave acquisition rate of more than 80%. Okay, me wearing sunglasses typically should be reserved for just the thumbnail of the video, so I'm taking this off now. But yeah, at the very least, for the bigger companies in the game industry that are publicly traded, they tend to actually disclose these numbers as well. So it is something that if you really wanted to, you could check to some extent. The one thing you have to understand with leave acquisition in Japan is that it is very difficult for people to want to use up 100%, and typically people won't go to that extent. I personally as well, I tend to, across all the companies I have worked in, use up at most maybe 80%. And the reason for this is that unlike most other countries, for some reason Japan just doesn't have the idea of a sick leave. So they don't have a separate set of leaves that you specifically take when you're sick and that you can use basically as a buffer so you can rest at home whenever. Instead, whenever you're sick, you actually have to use your paid leave. Of course, this can vary between companies as well. Like the current company I'm working for, they don't actually force you to use any days of leave. Instead, they just do what I did before and put on a pair of very cool sunglasses and pretend they didn't see it. and they just let you go by with just like getting your sick days off, which I feel is a much better way to ensure that people can afford a better work-life balance. But then again, I'm just your regular old salaryman who got overworked at some point in his life, so maybe I'm not the best person to be talking about this. But yeah, suffice to say, most people, as a result, just keep some days free as a buffer in case they fall sick. So you don't really see people going up to 100%, and it's also likely the reason why in many of these big companies as well, people only go up to 80 plus. Next up, we'll be talking about wages, pay, money. Very important thing, because without it, we'll all basically be like real from Bochis Rock, or be outside eating grass, which is a lot harder for me because living in the middle of a city means that there isn't much grass to begin with, and most of the grass that does exist probably covered in like some guy's piss or something due to all the drunks around Tokyo. So not the best way to go about living life. So we kind of do want to have at least some level of pay. Obviously, there are a lot of talk about pay being very low. A lot of people come to Japan to work from overseas and complain about low pay. Arguably, I would say that some of it is a little dependent on the industry you're working in, the occupation. Like if you're here teaching English in like a prep school, for example, obviously there's gonna be a much quicker ceiling that you will hit than someone who's working in a more technical role, simply due to the reason that everybody and their mother who wants to come to Japan to work and who doesn't have a technical skill would try to come in first as an English teacher. It's an easy way to enter the country, and most people typically use it as a springboard to jump into another industry later on. Like some of the people I know who are interested in becoming voice actors, for example, in Japan, they actually come into Japan as an English teacher while trying to work their way in the industry. And even when it comes to locals as well, there are many people whose wages tend to be pretty bad. I mean, there are plenty of YouTubers out there in Japan who initially started out in a pretty black company. I think one of the ones that I actually frequently watch actually showed one of his pay slips, and he was basically earning about 180,000 yen a month, which if you're working in Tokyo, that's a very low pay to survive on. Nowadays, the average that you would expect a fresh graduate to get is somewhere around 220,000, which I would argue is also still pretty low, since in Tokyo, a decent 1k, wait, no, not $1,000, that kind of 1k, but it's the term used for a room with one kitchen. So a one room place with a kitchen is called a 1k. If you want to get at least that, which is quite close to the bare minimum, it would cost you somewhere around 50,000 to 90,000 yen thereabout. So you'd be pretty hard pressed to just pay for your rent as is, let alone trying to live within the city. And it's very tough, especially if you're a weeb. I mean, you just look at how expensive weeb stuff is getting nowadays. I mean, just look at the price of figures nowadays, right? Like, it's getting up there. Like, I remember, like, back in my day. Look, I'm not that old, alright? For the game industry, it tends to be higher than the average. For example, according to a separate set of data from the Ministry of Labour with a very long name, which I still can't fully remember in English, it does state there that the average yearly income of someone within the game industry is around 5,790,000 yen, which is about 480,000 yen per month. The hell? There's no way that's right. Bro, I really should go check. I should be paid way more if that's the case. Give me a second here. Come on, this has to be bullshit. Like, please do explain how did they arrive at this number? Yeah. Okay, average age 42. Yeah, I guess the boomers would be paid a lot more, huh? Bloody hell. But yeah, okay, so the number itself is a little bit of a joke. I mean, the number is accurate, but it's not meant to depict a fresh graduate. When you look at fresh graduates, according to the data they have on the website, it says it's around 260,000 yen, which sounds about right for the industry. Like, I did hop jobs multiple times, so I do actually get to look at this data quite a bit, since I usually go through many of the recruitment firms that do like gather all of this data, and they do show me both like jobs fit for the number of years of experience I have, and sometimes the fresh graduate ones as well. And when I look at the fresh graduate pay like offerings, it's typically somewhere around 220,000 to the 250,000. So 260,000 is a little on the higher side, but then again, the last time I looked at this data was quite a while back for fresh graduates, maybe like 2 years ago. So maybe there was some level of increase, especially with the inflation recently, which yeah, everything's been getting expensive. But suffice to say, either way, compared to the general average of 220,000, no matter what site's data you choose to use as a reference point, it is certainly higher than the general national average. But yeah, I guess that's about all of the points within this video that I can actually back up with statistics due to the fact that these are the points that basically are also used as metrics to decide whether or not a company is actually one that is worth entering as well. And therefore, these are the things that, while they're also stereotypes of the Japanese work culture and the workforce in general, that I can also give some level of data to try and get my point across better. Now, the rest of the points we'll be going into are more culture related. So basically things that aren't exactly set in stone. They aren't things that are protected by law, but they just have been a large part of how Japan hires and treats its staff, based more on like work cultures as well as the overall culture itself. Speaking of wanting to change jobs because your pay is horrible though, I get that there's also a very strong impression that in Japan, people tend to not change their jobs and they tend to stay in one company. If you're just looking at the number of people who are leaving their jobs, that number in and of itself isn't very difficult to find. And in fact, many game companies actually do provide the data of the number of people who leave the company within the first 3 years that they are with the company as well. So for people who are more or less fresh graduates who are leaving like this, you can more or less assume that they are probably looking for a job somewhere else as well. So when we look at a company like Konami, for example, and we see that the people who enter the company and within their first 3 years, for those people there's an attrition rate of 20%, we can more or less see that many people within these companies are actually leaving with a very high likelihood of seeking employment elsewhere. And so it isn't exactly that uncommon nowadays as compared to what people might actually expect from the Japanese workforce in general. But for the most part, for most of the companies I've been in, my general perception I see is that it is quite common, at least within the game industry. People typically stay for a bunch of projects and then they leave if they feel like they are not able to fulfill what their goals are within the company. And most companies are pretty receptive to picking people up as well. However, there is a certain level of limit to that. And this comes in two forms. First is that if you're early in your career, you don't want to jump too much. That is still looked upon quite badly in Japan. Which you might then think, wait a minute, shouldn't it be the reverse? Isn't when you're young when you should be jumping the most to gain experience and learn more from all of the different companies so that you can become more talented and therefore contribute better to the company you want to stay for in the long haul in the future? Well, you see, that would make a lot of sense, but you forget, you're in Japan, the land where weird shit happens, and so as a result, it tends to be the reverse. If you job hop too much when you're actually young, most companies will actually look upon it as you being someone that's unreliable instead, and therefore there is this general stigma against people who hop more than twice. Though that said, this of course depends on the number of years you've stayed with the companies as well. Typically, they would expect people to at least stay for 5 years minimum before the hop. Maybe if you stayed for less during your first hop, people might still be fine with it, but the second and third time, if it's not at least 5 years, companies tend to get very apprehensive about hiring people who hop quite a bit. Also, aside from that, Japan has for a very long time had a belief in a more generalist style of hiring, and what I mean by this is that rather than hiring the best and most capable person for a job, especially at a fresh graduate level, they tend to have a belief that it is better to hire someone who has the right mentality and the right personality that is a fit with the company and that looks like they would have potential to grow in the future. And to hire these people, even if their qualifications may not necessarily 100% match the job. Now, needless to say, this doesn't work for all occupations. You can't do this for things like doctors, right? Medicine in general. You can't do that for law. Programming is a little iffy, but nowadays you start to see it more as well, where there are many jobs, though typically in black companies, where they're willing to hire people with no programming experience and they're willing to train them from the ground up to code as well. And this is something that I've seen in some of the companies I've worked in the past as well. Like literally there was a person that was brought in with a degree in mineralogy, right? The rock thing, you know. You take a magnifying glass to the rock and go like, I wonder if I could speak to it. And that's a bit of a hyperbole, but someone with a degree in that was brought into the company as a fresh graduate to instead work on like gacha planning for mobile games instead. Like this is really a very strange thing to hear perhaps, but it is part of the whole belief that, especially when it comes to fresh graduates, that you could take someone, teach them the thing, and then put them in the job. And this applies to even like people who have been in the company for a long while. Sometimes they take someone who has no experience in something, and they try to put them in that position because of a belief that these people, because they are competent in this one thing, if they put them in the other thing, they would be able to adapt and grow, and therefore be able to do this other thing as well, which you can actually see happening in some of the games that have released in the past and that have also failed magnificently because of that. I think the biggest example of this was one that I made a video about in the past called Gundam Evolutions. Basically, they took someone whose only ever like track record of making games was basically working on the monetization for browser games and putting that person in the position of the producer for this game that was supposed to basically be a Gundam esports game, which the game it ended up being fine, but it was just kind of unfortunate that a lot of stuff, especially on the monetization side, ended up being so horrible that it drove away players as well. And I feel like a large part of the issues was probably due to the fact that they basically put someone who didn't really have that much knowledge or understanding of the product you're supposed to produce in the position leading the project instead. I mean, like, it's not even like this guy was very successful in the previous projects he did. Like, he actually failed most of them. He was actually, like, memed on and clowned on in some of the servers for some of the actual games that he actually produced in the past because people just thought that he was just that wholly incompetent. But still, the company believes that by virtue of the fact that he has been in the company for a long time, he should have the capabilities to do this other thing as well. And there is a lot of this within the game industry, especially in larger companies. And this brings us on to the next point I want to talk about, which is I feel like this might be something that also happens quite a bit overseas, but there tends to be this focus more on the companies that a person has worked on in the past. And rather than looking at what they did within the company, people tend to look at just that, the company itself, and use that as a gauge to decide whether or not a person is highly professional and skilled and worth hiring. Like, this was one thing that I had quite a bit when I worked in Gang Ho as well, where because of the fact that they made Puzzles and Dragons, by like association, people automatically assume that if you're from the company, you're super skilled. But this, in a way, ended up serving as a good way for me to also gauge like whether the people I'm talking to would be someone I would want to work under in the future. In the sense that, like, if they think that because someone has the branding of a company behind them, they are very skilled automatically, then they probably don't know as much as they should about development as well. And therefore, it kind of helps me to scope like whether or not these people are people that would be easy to work with. And you can see this happening in many other companies as well within Japan. Like, I feel like I go back a lot to Gundam Evolutions, but you do see that happening simultaneously in that title as well, where they basically took a bunch of professional gamers, like esports players, and they were like, yeah, you know what? I see that you have been very good at playing games. I bet you'll be great at making them with no experience. And they basically hired them to do most of the development, and as you can imagine, that didn't end up going too well for the game as well. And it's not just them that had that problem either. You kind of see the same thing happening in Koei Tecmo as well, where even in spite of the fact that Gast had really never made a mobile gacha game before in the past, they decided to just lump all of the responsibility of creating Atelier Online onto the company. And for those of you who knew about the game, you would know that it was quite a big catastrophic failure. And when you think about it, it really doesn't come as too much of a surprise in a way, due to the fact that you basically have a company that was highly skilled in developing a certain style of RPG, and they were basically told to create a mobile game with like no experience and no external help to assist them in developing this. And as you can imagine, the game ended up being more of an RPG and not well balanced enough as a mobile game, and that resulted to it rapidly ending service, or well, rapid for its era at least. And there's also a stereotype that when it comes to working in Japan, that seniority is very important within a company, that you basically have to listen to the words of the people above you, and that you aren't really allowed to like tell them what they're doing is wrong and the like, which it does exist in many companies still. In fact, many of the companies that say that they are flat, she's really not that flat, but although at the very least within most of the companies I've worked in, at least it isn't as bad. Although if you end up working in a more traditional game company, you can still see that happening as well. There is one company I worked in, I'm not going to name them, which did have that issue quite badly, but for the most part in many, if you're willing to actually point out an issue, most people are willing enough to admit that they're wrong if it is wrong nowadays, so it's not as bad as before. And you don't really have to do the verbal tai chi that was necessary in like maybe 10, 15 years ago that basically required you to tell them they are wrong, but in a very roundabout way, where you essentially had to tell them that you think their interpretation of something is this way instead of what they said, and that if this is what they meant, then this is super good as compared to this. And so you believe that this is what they said. And then you hope and you pray to the high heavens that they take the hint and they're like, yeah, this is what I want. And then you're supposed to thank them for being the big brain for like actually referring to this instead, and to apologize for being so stupid that you actually didn't realize this from the start. Like the whole thing used to be really toxic and stupid in the past, but suffice to say, in the game industry nowadays, it's not like that much anymore. This whole emphasis on seniority and generalism does play a role in why many companies, especially visual novel companies in the past, that try to make mobile games or full big title games now are failing as well. There's a lot of things that basically would end up being something that people who are specialized in one thing may not know in the other. And as a result of this belief that this highly skilled, loyal employees can do that other thing, you just end up in situations where they just crash and burn instead. Right, okay, this is probably getting on to be a very long video, but two more things that we want to talk about, or I want to talk about. There's no we here other than me, them, and my friends over here. For one thing is the lack of intern positions and the strange ways that part-timers are treated in some companies as well. And what I mean by this is that unlike in most companies where you have intern positions where people in universities can basically enter a company and learn to some extent on the job, like how companies operate and what kind of jobs they can look forward to doing in the future as well. In Japan, it's very uncommon, and even when it does exist, they tend to exist in a way that's very different from overseas as well. For example, the JR, Japan Rails, they actually do have their own internship, but the internship only lasts for 2 weeks. Yeah, I don't know what you're supposed to learn from the company within 2 weeks, especially one that has as much history and as much complication as like trying to run an entire nationwide like train network. Like it's very strange. And even in some of the game companies I've worked in the past, you have like 1 month internships, which like I don't know how much a person is supposed to be able to pick up within 1 month. Like 1 month is the amount of time some companies give people just to like their full-time employees to just pick up what the company is about, let alone giving an intern a month expecting them to learn something interesting. Obviously, if your person in charge is very skilled, which I have seen some that are really good, they can actually give these people a good learning experience. But even then, those people are few and far between simply because the idea of an internship is just not that common. And when it comes to part-timers, it's this very weird thing where we're not talking about like contract workers or something, or people who are like outsourced to the company, but literally talking about people who are paid as a separate thing, basically an arubaito in the company, so a part-timer, but in an office position in these companies. And these people, they're basically treated even worse than the outsourced labor at times, because essentially they don't get leave in some of the companies I've seen at least. So they still have to work the entire like full year, or like however many years they're expected to work, as a sort of like trial phase for the employee before they actually enter the company. But unlike an intern where you do it for a few months, these people do it for potentially years on end, earning an hourly wage with no days off. And if they actually do take a day off, even despite the fact that like they're working for years at the company, they just have their pay deducted instead because they don't have days off. And it also basically affects their potential chance of being hired by the company, because it just looks bad on their record that they just didn't turn up for work on a day or two. There's one thing that I never understood about like why some companies have this kind of part-time positions. Like it's very predatory, and I do feel that is the case. Like it's a very weird way of doing part-time positions in like an office position in a game company. And lastly, it's the treatment of externally made media, basically like what Nintendo does with like the aversion to fan-made content and stuff like that. And it's not just Nintendo that's like that. I would say that especially those with a much older generation at the helm, they tend to all be like this instead. And this, I would say, is due to some extent to the existence of doujin content, which for those of you who don't know what doujin content is, look, for the simplicity of this video, you can just think of it as like indie content, except that sometimes this indie content can be fan-made works of something that exists, like Hollow Cure, for example. Japan now, I would say it's split into two generations of people. One generation that basically are stuck in the world of old media, they look at basically even stuff like doujin content, which has existed for like decades at this point, as basically people who are like leeches off of their own, like the company's own works. And many of them in this older generation, they believe that like the IPs they create are theirs and others shouldn't be able to profit off of it in any way, shape or form. So stuff like a YouTube video as well, because a lot like doujin content where people basically make a fan game and sell it for a nominal sum to other fans of the same thing. They basically see YouTube creators as leeches, as parasites as well, which is a little funny since I'm making this video now, you know.
I'm in danger!
I guess in a way that makes me a, yeah. But yeah, even if the work is transformative, even if, like, for example, something like Hollow Cure, where you're making something completely different just based off the IP for friends to play, and it's free to play even, there are some companies that would actually come down on stuff like that as well, simply because they feel like people shouldn't be allowed to make the thing and get the attention and propel their career in the future. I would say that like newer game companies, the newer generation at least, are more understanding. They understand the importance of fan-created content towards the success of an IP. But yeah, suffice to say, there are many people who are also still stuck in the older generation as well. Like one of the reasons why Judge Eyes, for example, didn't actually release on like PC for a very long time was because the boomers, the absolute boomers who basically were in charge of the talent agency for the voice actor for the game, they were so out of touch with reality that they somehow believe that like they can't put him on a PC version of the game because that will put him on a medium that's connected to the internet, and therefore they didn't want that to happen. That somehow seems to neglect the fact that a console is also connected to the internet. Yeah, it's very silly, but there's a lot of weird like things like this that happen within the industry still. And yeah, like I feel like it's probably gonna be a while until we wait for this entire group of people to just like leave the fucking industry, since they probably be like in a retirement home at this point. Before we might see many of these companies become more progressive as well, but we'll talk more about that in the other video in the future as well. But yeah, when it comes to this first video, which I plan to do as a way to start off the entire series, I think this is about all that I want to share this time. I do hope this video was entertaining. I know that it's not very much into the industry itself just yet, but I kind of want to set this premise of what the industry is like now, so that in the future we can then go more in depth into these points as well, and have these basically form the basis for us to begin looking more at why the industry is the way it is and how it is doing and why it is going in certain directions. I do hope you enjoyed this video, like genuinely, and if you watched to this point, I thank you so much for doing so. Like quite frankly, I don't know how long this video is gonna be, but I get the feeling it's gonna be relatively long-ish as well. Maybe not an hour, maybe it will be, I don't know. We'll see once I edit the video. For those of you who are new to the channel of this video, hey! The videos don't all tend to be like this. More often than not, I'm just talking about weeb events in Japan as well as very shitty games that I have played or am playing now just for the sake of making funny videos about how shitty they are. And once in a while I do talk about like the game industry, either about like certain events that happen or basically just about the industry in general at points where it makes sense because I actually understand the topic enough to want to talk about it. If you're interested in any of that, do feel free to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching. I feel like I already said the last point, but it really does mean a lot to me. So yeah, the next video is probably gonna be event related, and we'll be doing one about Kasugi sometime, both of which will probably be in March. I actually might do like 3 videos in March, but suffice to say, the video on the industry, the part 2 to this, will come in a few months time. There we'll talk more about how the points I brought in this video have affected the type of labor that exists within Japan as well, or the type of talent that exists. So I do hope you enjoy that video when it comes out, and I do hope you look out for it if you're interested. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Thank you to Ran Yakumo, Rosio, Nick Green, and Kaori for the support for the channel. Like the fact that you guys are willing to help put some money towards me making all of these videos, whether it be something a little more serious like this, or something a little more silly like me just huffing G Fuel or something. It truly does mean a lot, and it does help quite a lot with it, since a lot of the silly stuff I tend to do, some of it does cost a little bit of money to get the props for, and it does help to like pay for some of the stuff that helps to make it easier for me to continue to make videos. Of course, everyone else as well, you're all special. You're all breathtaking, right? That's the meme, right? You're all breathtaking. I actually do mean that though, you're all great people. So thank you all for watching. But that said, I'll be heading off for now. Thank you all for watching once again. I'm gonna get out of this suit now as it's actually surprisingly hot, even though it's winter, to wear this. So then, I'll be heading off now. And until next time, take care and goodbye.